Hi, everybody. This week we're looking at the author James Cone. Cone is a different kind of author than we've had previously in the course. He is a trained and practicing, or was a trained and practicing Christian theologian. Howard Thurman certainly comes close to that as a very reflective person, kind of laying some of the intellectual foundations for the civil rights movement. But Cone used his training as a theologian to carry forward the kind of theoretical side of the civil rights movement. And by that I mean laying out a framework where people could understand what had happened, what was happening, and what was to happen. What are the ways forward? And that's something we'll be thinking about a lot as we move now toward the end of the course. So let's take a look at the work of James Cone. This is the man himself, and we're reading his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. Of course, we're reading just 2 chapters of that book, and I'll say a bit more about that. James Cone himself was, before the year of his death in 2018, one of the most respected and influential American theologians in the Protestant tradition, but really in any Christian tradition, and an outstanding, what we would call public intellectual, someone who refused to let his thinking be confined to the seminar room and the lecture hall, but sought ways to bring the fruits of his reflection out into the world and to seek to create change in positive ways as a result. He was born in 1938. Here we have an image of him, I think, from the 1970s. It could be from the early 1980s. Cone was trained in European theology. Now, we haven't talked a great deal about theology in the course. It's funny seeing as it's the theology of the civil rights movement. By theology, what I have in mind is a disciplined reflection on God. So, theos in Greek means God. Logos, we can say, means the study of something or the investigation of the kind of rationale of something, what it means, right? And so, in this case, Cone was someone who had read all of the kind of influential authors across the history of especially European theology. And he, early in his career, and dutifully wrote his dissertation and got an academic job and started publishing papers and did what people do in that line of work. Later, though, he came, as I mentioned in the second point here, as I say in the second point, to a crisis point. As I put it on the slide here, the theology he was doing did not seem to connect with the experience of his community or his own experience. He began to wonder, well, why am I engaged in and devoting such enormous energy to these fairly abstract kind of debates about the nature of God or the Trinity or the church? Or, all of these are very important debates, but this was the 1960s, right? History, we can say, was happening on the streets in a very visible way. And James Cone, as an academic, asked the question that many of us probably would ask in the same circumstances is how is my work contributing to that effort, or how is it not contributing to it? How am I perhaps even absenting myself from this movement at a time when I have resources that could be useful to it? As a result of that crisis point, he wrote the book Black Theology and Black Power. That was published in 1969. It came around the same time as a work by another theologian, Gustavo Gutierrez, A Theology of Liberation. I mention that because this was a time when theologians were very interested, and as many are still today, in how their work connects with what is actually happening in the events in one's society. And both Gutierrez and Cone, in different ways, developed kind of liberation theology, a theology focused on the struggle and the suffering of people, actual people living right now, and asked the question of how theology could be put in the service of supporting their struggle for justice and truth. Now, we're moving here pretty quickly from the 1960s and 70s up until close to the present in 2011 to talk about the book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. You'll see from the other video that I've posted on our e-learning page that this book was regarded by Cone as one of his I forget if he says his favorites. People often ask him what is his favorite book, right? I think this is, in my view, a culmination of his life's work, and a book that he spent many years working on, and a book that has been highly influential among other theologians. We're reading two chapters from the book, chapter 1 and chapter 3. In chapter 1, he introduces, as I put it here on the slide, the painful history of lynching as a practice, not just in the American South, but across the country. It is a painful chapter to read, especially in the first part of the chapter. I mean, he talks first about the practice of lynching, and then he moves on to talk about the blues and spirituals and ways in which the black community sought to respond to this through culture and art. It's a difficult chapter to read, but a very important one. And I think that difficulty is one that repays with greater insight on the part of us as readers. In chapter 3, he looks specifically at the work and the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. So that's going to be helpful in terms of our course, given that we've spent so much time looking at King. The Cross and the Lynching Tree, the title of the book. The cross, of course, here refers to the implement, the means by which Jesus of Nazareth was executed by the Roman authorities around the year 33. The lynching tree refers to a tree on which a person would be hung, usually at the agency or due to the actions of a large group or even a smaller group. Very often, well, I mean, far be it from me, I think we all know what lynching refers to. Cone is linking these two, and he's suggesting through this linkage that these two torture devices, in effect, carry the potential for a kind of redemption, or are ways in which, if you link the cross with the lynching tree, you can see how the suffering, the unjust and tragic and grotesque suffering of the person who is lynched is similar to the tragic and grotesque suffering of Jesus of Nazareth on the cross. And just as Christians have found meaning and redemption through the cross over the centuries, so too is it possible through the suffering of the black community in the United States for a kind of redemption, a kind of meaning to be found as we continue to struggle for justice, of course, to prevent any such actions ever again to be undertaken. We have a couple passages here from the book. The cross, Cone writes, is a paradoxical religious symbol because it inverts the world's value system with the news that hope comes by way of defeat, that suffering and death do not have the last word, that the last shall be first, and the first last. We often talk about the paradox of the cross. Why? Well, I mean, think about the holiday in the Christian tradition of Good Friday, right? Why would you possibly call it Good Friday? Good Friday is the day in the Christian calendar that marks the death of Jesus on the cross. It comes 3 days before Easter Sunday, the day on which Christians believe, or when Christians celebrate Jesus' resurrection. So the paradox here is that through brokenness, suffering, and even death, what do we have here? Looking at the quote, hope comes by way of defeat, right? And so there's the greatest thing within Christianity, salvation, won for Christians by the death of Jesus the Christ, came by means of what looked like weakness and defeat. Believing this paradox, Cone continues, this absurd claim of faith, and take a moment for it to settle in, friends, the absurd claim of faith, believing it was only possible through God's amazing grace, and the gift of faith, grounded in humility and repentance. There was no place for the proud and the mighty, for people who think that God called them to rule over others. The cross was God's critique of power, of white power, with powerless love, snatching victory out of defeat. And I would offer this thought that might be helpful for us. When we talk about faith within the Christian tradition or within theology, within theology of the civil rights movement, we don't mean a kind of faith that a supernatural trick occurred, and Jesus of Nazareth, rose from the dead. Well, remarkable claim. But we mean in a deeper way this that Cohn expresses here. The absurd claim of faith is that the world value system, right? No, wait a second. The absurd claim of faith is that um, let's see. There is no place for the proud and the mighty, for people who think that God called them to rule over others. The strong, those who appear to be the strong in this world, are in fact not the strong, that strength comes through a kind of worldly weakness. Um, this is the real object of faith for James Cone, and I think for many within the Christian tradition. It's not believing in a kind of magic trick. It's believing that through weakness and goodness and even through suffering and death, great good can come about. We need to touch upon the early portions of this chapter, which again I recommend to your very serious attention, a passage from Combe. Lynching was an extra legal punishment sanctioned by the community. Many scholars date its origin in Virginia during the Revolutionary War when Charles Lynch or William Lynch, both were called the original Judge Lynch, with the support of the community punished Tory sympathizers. As communities moved westward, rustlers, robbers, wife abusers, and others who committed what a community perceived as outrageous deeds were subjected to lynching. So lynching is named after a person, it seems to be a historical person, and it's extrajudicial or extra legal, as he puts it here. So it's a kind of mob rule, right? It's an act of the mob against an individual that those people regard for whatever reason as having committed the crime. Perhaps the person has indeed committed the crime. Perhaps the person has not committed the crime. What the word lynching has come to refer to in this tragic chapter of our own country's history, of course, is the killing, the extra legal killing of black and brown people of color, by most often white people for actions or not actions that were not crimes. This is the great stain that is lynching in American history. Cone, again, African Americans embraced the story of Jesus, the crucified Christ, whose death they claimed paradoxically gave them life. There's that notion of paradox again. They did this just as God resurrected him in the life of the earliest Christian community. While the lynching tree symbolized white power and black death, the cross symbolized divine power and black life, God overcoming the power of sin and death. So again, here we're moving away from a kind of, I'll call it again, a kind of magic trick understanding of the Christian message. Faith is not believing that the laws of physics are suspended. Here, Cone proposes a different phrase, a different framing, that God resurrected Jesus in the life of the earliest Christian community. How did hope and strength and the ability to go on come out of the brutal killing of Jesus of Nazareth, the leader of what came to be called the Christian movement, what was called at the time the Way, right? That same possibility that out of suffering and death can come strength and hope and a kind of redemption is the possibility at the heart of Cone's book. In the second half of the chapter, Cone talks about the blues and also about spirituals as a genre of especially African American music. We'll look at a couple passages and I'll just comment on them briefly, but I recommend this whole portion of the chapter again to your close attention. It's a really interesting and beautiful portion, seeing as he includes all these lyrics from songs. Blacks, Cone writes, found hope in blues music itself, a collective, self-transcendent meaning in the singing, dancing, loving, and laughing. They found hope in the stoic determination not to be defeated by the pain and suffering in their lives. James Baldwin called this hope an ironic tenacity. I've got the blues and I'm too damn mean to cry. The blues, as Ralph Ellison put it, is an impulse to keep the painful details and episodes of a brutal experience alive in one's aching consciousness, to finger its jagged grain, and to transcend it, not by the consolation of philosophy, but by squeezing from it a near tragic, near comic lyricism. That's a very beautiful line from Ralph Ellison. Um, Not by the consolation of philosophy, right? This term, the consolation of philosophy, is something you'll sometimes hear in various authors. What's that consolation? That I think about it, I discern a kind of reason for why it happened, and that wisdom derived from that gives me a kind of comfort. Another word for comfort is consolation. Um, the blues is for Ellison and for Cohn not that, right? It's not a matter of rationalizing something or looking for a reason in it. It's a matter of expression, right? It's a matter, as he puts it here, of not to be defeated. That is, a matter not of not being defeated by pain and suffering in one's life, but rather singing, dancing, loving, and laughing, and bringing a kind of joy out of this great suffering. It's maybe a reach to call it joy, because as Ellison puts it near the end here, near tragic, near comic lyricism. It's not comic, it's not simply happy, right? But it's also not simply tragic. This is one way in which the black community in the United States has sought to bring meaning out of the tragic and unexcusable event of a lynching in a way that I see Cohn comparing with how the early Christian community brought meaning out of the tragic event of Jesus of Nazareth's crucifixion on the cross. Cohn. Unlike the spirituals and the church, the blues and the juke joint did not lead to an organized political resistance against white supremacy. But one could correctly say that the spirituals and the church, with Jesus' cross at the heart of its faith, gave birth to the black freedom movement that reached its peak in the civil rights era during the 1950s and 60s. The spirituals were the soul of the movement, giving people courage to fight, and the church was its anchor, deepening its faith in the coming freedom for all. The blues was an individual's expression of cultural defiance against white supremacy, a stubborn refusal to be defined by it. So here we have the blues on the one hand and the spirituals and the church on the other. And these are really just one hand and the other. They're not opposed to each other, right? They're just two distinct things. What is the blues? The blues is over here. What is the blues doing? The blues is supporting individuals, right? As they defy white supremacy, as they refuse to be defined by that. That's on an individual level. Whereas the spirituals and the church, and by spirituals we mean hymns, we mean church music, right? What does that do? That, Cohn suggests, is what led to the Black Freedom Movement. That's what we saw happening already in Montgomery, Alabama. So what we saw, Montgomery, it's what we saw happening in Birmingham as well later on, right? People would sing. During the bus boycott, people would sing as they walked. When they gathered at the church in the evening to hear from Abernathy and King, they would sing for hours sometimes before King and Abernathy took the stage. So this music was not just a kind of entertainment. This was a glue. This was something holding that community together. I want to comment a bit on chapter 3. Here, Cohn is drawing on a few things related to the work of Martin Luther King Jr., as we've mentioned. He begins from the murder of Emmett Till and identifies this indeed as what it was, as a lynching, extra legal killing that was in fact illegal, right, and deeply immoral. From there, he goes on to trace how this event, and we saw this already back in the first week of the course, right, did more than anything else, as he puts it, to launch the civil rights movement. A quotation from Representative John Lewis of happy memory, recently deceased. A lot of us young black students in the South, said Lewis, weren't sitting in just for ourselves. We were sitting in for Emmett Till. Right? So the case of Emmett Till's murder is something that drove the civil rights movement from early on. Cohn is a theologian, so he's looking at the sources of Christian faith as a Christian theologian, and trying to understand both how those sources might have influenced people at the time and also how those sources can help us to understand these events today. He writes, Black Christians saw in the response of Till's mother to her son's lynching a reflection of the spiritual struggles of Job. We'll pause there just for a moment. You remember, just to recall to mind, in the Eyes on the Prize episode that we watched, there was a great deal on the actions of Till's mother. She insisted on having an open casket funeral for her murdered son so that everyone could see what they did to my boy, as she famously put it. The image of Till's mangled face from the violence he had endured uh, did much to galvanize the civil rights movement in its earliest years. So we're thinking about that response from Till's mother, and we're going to look at a couple aspects of it, continuing with Cohn's passage. On the one hand, her prayers reflected the obedient and patient spirit of the biblical Job. Lord, take my soul, show me what you want me to do, and make me able to do it. Yet, on the other hand, there was the rebellious spirit of the angry Job, who, feeling wronged by God, cried out in the anguish of my spirit and the bitterness of my soul, Why have you made me your target? She, Till's mother, also railed at God. Why did you do this? Why are you so cruel that you would let this happen? Why do you allow this kind of persecution? It's important to recall some of the particulars of this story of Job. This is a diagram of all of the books of the Bible. So that includes the Old Testament on the left. Hebrew Scriptures are what Christians call the Old Testament. That's 46 books. And the New Testament on the right, and that's 27 books. I've always found this chart helpful. You kind of open up a Bible, you're like, well, what's in here, right? Well, pause the video and take a look. This is what's in there. The book of Job is here in what is called the wisdom books. So it's the first of the wisdom books. This follows the law, or what's called the Pentateuch, and those are the books many people know, Genesis and Exodus, etc. The historical books come underneath that, and that's stories about the history of the people of Israel. And the wisdom books follow that, and that includes the book of Job. And it's not pronounced Job, but Job. In the story, and here we have an image from William Blake, a famous image of the suffering of Job. In short, God is hanging out in heaven, and Satan comes by. In Hebrew, the word Satan means the accuser, and this is one of the first appearances, I believe, of the figure of Satan in the Old Testament. So Satan comes by and says, Hey, you got a pretty good servant down there in Job, huh? And God says, Oh, yeah, Job's great. And Satan says, Well, it's not so hard for him to be great, right? Because he's wealthy, beautiful wife, beautiful children, lots of livestock, good health. Of course he would praise you, right? And God says, well, that's not the only reason he praises me. He praises me because he's good. I'm paraphrasing. And Satan says, oh, really? He's good, huh? Well, if you let me at him and let me take away some of these nice things that he has, I bet we'll see how good he really is. And God says, oh, yeah? Well, go for it. Yeah, do it. So suddenly, Job is, again paraphrasing, struck down with all kinds of torment. He loses his livestock, he loses his children, and he eventually loses his health, among many other things. In fact, he's so reduced by the kind of climax of the story that he's sitting on the ground and scraping himself with a shard of pottery. So think about like a clay pot. You break it, right? You take a little shard, and he's scraping himself with it because he has all these terrible pussy sores on his body. Oof, God. So what happens in the story to Job, I mean, he's faithful, he's faithful, he's faithful, right, throughout the story. And then he's really tempted and he's really tried by what you see in this image here. So he has the three friends of Job, and they come to him and they basically say, Job, you must have done something wrong. Yeah, because look at yourself. God is punishing you. This is obvious. What are you not telling us, right? It looked like you were such an upstanding guy, but God doesn't do this kind of thing just because, right? And even his wife, depicted here on the left of the screen, says, Job, why don't you curse God and die? Right? And so Job, in a certain moment, becomes the kind of what Cohn calls the rebellious, angry Job, and he cries out to heaven, what I do, in short, right? And then God speaks to Job famously out of the whirlwind. So there's a natural phenomenon, and Job hears the voice of God through this heavy wind. And the story results in Job being granted back everything that he had lost. And we could do an entire class only on the story of Job. We could do an entire course only on the story of Job. But it's important to know these details, I think, in order to understand what Cohn means to be saying here, that when someone is subjected to such suffering, not only can one remain faithful, but one can also cry out angrily to God. And there is, you want to talk about theology, talk about the tradition, there is a precedent for this. And this book of Job, across the Jewish and Christian traditions, has been a source of very deep and ongoing reflection on the nature of suffering. After this, he turns to King specifically, and how King answered this call that he understood himself to have from God, that he felt he had. Let's look at this, and I want to look especially at some difference that Cohn emphasizes, I think, for reasons related to his own trajectory, Cohn's own trajectory, between King and another theologian, Reinhold Niebuhr. So Cohn writes the following. It is one thing to teach theology, like Niebuhr, Barth, Tillich, and most theologians, in the safe environs of a classroom, and quite another to live one's theology in a situation that entails the risk of one's life. King agreed fully with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Christian pastor hanged in 1945 by the Nazis for resisting Hitler. Bonhoeffer, who said, when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. What is Cohn saying by this? First of all, I would recommend that line to our reflection, each of us, as I think it's a really profound statement from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, an interesting figure I wish we could cover in the course, about the Christian call to discipleship. It's a term that would be used, that a person who is a Christian is not simply a person who is generally nice or even a person who goes to church, right? But a person who is willing to sacrifice herself and to sacrifice her attachments and things that she values in order to serve others in Christ, right? To serve others as a Christian, and to do what is necessary. And this is very much what King himself saw himself doing. Cohn as well, in his way, right? Because Cohn himself recognized that to do theology in these safe environs, it risks becoming merely, as we saw earlier, a consolation of philosophy, right? I feel good because I'm reflecting on these deep things, rather than actually engaging in history, certainly as Jesus of Nazareth himself did. So there's a contrast he draws between one of those theologians he named and King, not so much on whether one should be engaged in the world, but specifically how that engagement should look. Right? Reinhold Niebuhr was a theologian in New York City throughout much of his career, and certainly a voice in the public conversation at that time to a degree that we rarely see today. People looked to Niebuhr. They wanted to know what Niebuhr thought about things. And here's something that he thought about things. He's a very reflective and serious person. Unlike King, Cohn writes, Niebuhr viewed agape love. We learned about that recently, right? Viewed agape love as revealed in Jesus' cross as an unrealizable goal in history, a state of perfection which no individual or group in society could ever fully hope to achieve. For Niebuhr, Jesus' cross was an absolute transcendent standard that stands in judgment over any human achievement. The most we can realize is what he called proximate justice, which Niebuhr defined as a balance of power between powerful collectives. Right? So we learned about agape love, and it doesn't mean just being nice, right? It means a deep, self-sacrificing, unconditional love for one's neighbor, maybe King achieved that. Maybe individuals can achieve that, right? But for Niebuhr, it's not a practical political program. It's not feasible that entire societies could be bound together by this kind of profound self-sacrificial love, such as Niebuhr's view, right? And King took a different side, as Cohn describes. In contrast to Niebuhr, right, King never spoke about proximate justice or about what was practically possible to achieve. That would have killed the revolutionary spirit in the African American community. Instead, King focused on and often achieved what Niebuhr said was impossible. What do you want? King would call out before a demonstration. Freedom, the demonstrators would shout back, ready to face angry white mobs and policemen. When do you want it? King would ask, his voice reaching a crescendo. Now. So Niebuhr was being practical, he's being pragmatic, he's being reasonable, right? Okay, we can't actually expect everybody to be motivated by this, and we need to seek some more kind of practical compromise. But King felt that in order to go over that tipping point, right? In order for real change to be achieved, you can't take this kind of pragmatic, compromising approach. You need to stand on your principle, right? And you need to have the strength of your convictions. And so he called for nothing less than an actual full realization of agape, of self-sacrificial, unconditional love in society. This is something that King's critics, and there were many, found to be impractical. I mean, many people at the time did side with Niebuhr. And I think there's a real debate here, and I'm not just saying that. I feel like this is a question that remains very important for us as we engage in any kind of public struggle. Back to Cohn here, we're going to talk about the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. If physical death is the price I must pay to free my white brothers and sisters from the permanent death of the spirit, King said, then nothing could be more redemptive. Right? Agape love in public, all the way, self-sacrificial love, right? When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. To redeem the soul of America, Cohn continues here, was the motto of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which meant creating the American dream and the beloved community. Creating the American dream and the beloved community. Not moving piecemeal in that direction, not thinking that we will never achieve it, but seeking to build and achieve in this lifetime or in the lifetime of our children, the beloved community, right? A community actually bound together by agape love. Last passage here from Cohn, and then we'll wrap up. King said, "There are some who still find the cross a stumbling block, and others consider it foolishness. But I am more convinced than ever before that the cross, is the power of God unto social and individual salvation. So like the Apostle Paul, I can now humbly and proudly say, I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. The suffering and agonizing moments through which I have passed over the last few years have also drawn me closer to God. More than ever before, I am convinced of the reality of a personal God." So, theology of the civil rights movement, where are we ending up here? King was a profound leader, an organizer, an inspiring figure in countless ways. He was also a profoundly committed Christian, right? And understood his practice in Christian terms. And that's what Cohn is helping us to think through today. He's also helping us, especially in this third chapter, to see the legitimate debates that occur around this. Because certainly when one's setting forth on a project, right, there's great energy. And look at King's, I don't want to say idealism, because it's not that it's not achievable, but he's talking about believing in the beloved community right now, right? Whereas Niebuhr is taking this more restrained kind of like chastened perspective, almost, right? Of we can't hope to achieve that. Let's not reach so far. I think as we determine today how each of us will engage in the struggles of our time, it's a real debate to enter into, and we can be inspired by King's example, along with many other things from King, as we negotiate that. And so, friends, some thoughts on James Cohn. We have, again, the image of the cross and the lynching tree. Just as From the cross, Christians have derived hope and strength and what they understand to be salvation. So, too, perhaps from the lynching tree, can we derive hope and strength and a kind, in its way, of salvation. Thank you very much.